Okay. So one of the fun things, I'm going to let Janet tell us about her career journey. That's actually the first question. But one of the interesting things is that coincidentally, Janet reached out to me after I spoke at an MIT event. And it turns out that we both went to Cornell in chemistry at the same time. So we have that connection. And then she and I both went to MIT for grad school. So there's a lot of parallels, but we ended up in very different places. So Janet, Janet was a professor in Switzerland, which is also a really interesting story because how do you end up, not very many of us end up becoming professors in Switzerland. So this is going to be an interesting story. So I'm going to let you tell it to us about yourself and your career, you know, how you got to where you are now, and now you're retired. So it's a complete story of where you got to so far.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation. And I wanted to keep this part a little bit shorter so that we have more time for the questions that everybody's interested in. In terms of the bona fides, I finished my work at MIT in 1988. I was a PhD in course 1W. And that's the W signifies the joint program between MIT and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and course 1 is Civil and Environmental Engineering. So when I finished with that, I went to Switzerland, to ELWAG, where I just retired from as a postdoc. And I spent 3 years there. It was really fun. And then I spent 15 years on the faculty, first at UCLA and then at Caltech in environmental science and engineering. Then I had a chance to go back to Switzerland as the director of ELWAG, which is the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology. And in that position, I also became professor at both ETH Zurich and ETH in Lausanne. So as Diane mentioned, I just retired. Switzerland has mandatory age-based retirement. And, but I was 16 years as director, which I think was basically long enough. And so I'm really looking forward to doing other kinds of things now that I have more flexibility in my timing. So.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, since we're talking about women's leadership, what is your definition of great leadership? And maybe you have a different definition for great women's leadership, but just tell us, you know, what you feel is that great definition.
Well, what I've seen as my role in leadership is to essentially create the framework conditions that allow the people in my organization to be really successful as they can be. And so that's different things for different people at different stages in their career, but it's really about enabling other people to be successful. And I think that that this holds true for both men and women in leadership positions. I think that sometimes what I've seen with men as leaders is that they tend to try and push forward more of an agenda of their own. I have never really felt so comfortable with that. I felt that it's more of a push-pull in terms of collecting the ideas that come bottom up and then really trying to channel them and integrate them and synthesize them into a coherent whole, as opposed to I have a vision and then I impose it on an organization. So that's really how I think about leadership. One of the really great things about Switzerland is that there is enormous resources and for education and research. And so you really have all of the resources you need to create that enabling environment. It's very rewarding. It has been very rewarding for me.
Now that you mentioned the difference in Switzerland, how do you think it's really different than here in the US, since you do have experience in both places? What do you think makes the Swiss model different and, you know, better in some ways?
Well, so there is a transition going on in Switzerland, and it's not uniform across all of the universities, but the whole tenure track concept is really only getting established now in Switzerland. it comes much more out of this old Germanic model where your position is essentially a senior position from the very start. It's not a track position. And so in some ways, I think of it that the US is a much better place to be a junior person, an assistant professor, associate professor. There's a track, there's a way to develop. And Europe is a much better place to be a senior professor because they give you a lot of resources. There's a sort of basic package to support the faculty that go along with senior positions. It's like having an endowed chair, but that's every single professor. And so that's really quite a different model.
Right. I know a number of students and postdocs who are applying for positions in Switzerland, actually. So it's interesting because when we write letters of recommendation for them, I don't think we were, I mean, I know I wasn't fully aware of the differences. So it's good to have that knowledge when you think about it. So in terms of your leadership journey, I was wondering if you could tell us about some of the obstacles that you faced and how you overcame them.
Well, the interesting thing for me was when I came to Switzerland and I was just sort of parachuted into this senior position. In some ways, that made it easier, and in some ways, maybe harder. So I had experience in the Swiss system but as a postdoc. And so of course that's a totally different perspective. And it was many, many years ago. So I had a little bit of knowledge about the system I was getting into, but I was really coming into it with a lack of background and experience. What helped was that the people in my organization at ERWAG, they were really engaged for the institution and very much wanted it to be successful. And somehow they realized without it being explained to them that success for the institution was bundled up with my success. And if I went down in flames, it was going to be bad across the board. And so I had sort of automatically had this level of support that was like, look, you're here, you're in this position, we want everything to work. So we're going to help to make it work. But at the same time, I didn't really have all the connections that you might want to have within the system. And it took me a while to develop that. Another thing was that at ERWAG, we generally speak English among the scientists because there are about 40 different nationalities in ERWAG. And so many people are already working in German as their second language. And then, for them to put on, to have to use that and then English for science is just very complicated. So with the scientists, I always spoke English. But it was a little bit of a challenge that my German, when I started, was not very good. You could argue it's still not very good, but it was definitely worse then. And on the other hand, this was also a good thing because what I did was I said, well, I don't want to be the one who goes out and represents ERWAG in a really illiterate level of German. I want the other members of my directorate to take that. Right. And so it sort of, in some ways, it forced me to share the responsibilities, but it also engaged these people even more because now they got to be also ambassadors for the institution and to present themselves together with the institution. I think that made it even stronger than it had been before. So all of those kinds of things, they have a plus side and a minus side, and you just have to work to accentuate the positive aspects.
Yeah, it looks like you really took every issue and sort of made the best out of it. But I think a couple times you mentioned, you didn't say the word collaborative, but it seems like it's more of a collaborative model of leadership that you were practicing rather than a more hierarchical or, top-down model?
Well, ERWAG in general has a fairly flat hierarchy, and we don't actually give out our resources the same way that the technical universities do, the ETH does and EPFL. So they really provide the resources for the individual professors, and then they kind of get to do whatever they want, and they have so much money that they don't have to think about other people. At ALOG, we don't do that. There are resources for the departments that are then shared among the group leaders there. There are resources that are held centrally and given out mainly on project basis. But people are always having a little bit to negotiate. And all of the major instrumentation at ALOG is shared, all of it, right? Nobody gets to say, this is my instrument, you can't use it. Each of the big instruments are in a specific department so that, somebody is responsible that it is maintained and operated. And it's certainly true that you can't just walk in and say, I need this instrument tomorrow. That's not going to happen. But if you have a valid reason to use a major instrument at ALOG, you are going to have that access. This is not true at ETH Zurich at all. And so I think that by having a system where a lot of the resources are shared, it basically pushes people in this direction of collaboration. And I think that's very positive. And I didn't start that it was there when I got there, that system.
That's a really interesting difference between how we do it in the US as well. I mean, we have certain instruments that are shared facilities, but that is really a great point. My next question has to do with what you consider your greatest accomplishment and why in your long career. So I'm sure you have lots of things, but maybe a couple of them.
So I am quite pleased at the way that ALOG developed over the 16 years that I was director. I think it was already in very good shape when I got there, but there was a certain level of, I don't say informality, it had grown a lot over the years, and somehow some of the processes hadn't quite kept up with it. And so there was sort of a joke with the former director that you could bump into him on the staircase, and then all of a sudden you had more resources because you just asked him and he said yes, right? And that happened to me fairly early on. Somebody came with a great idea about having a scholarship program for students from developing countries. And he said, wouldn't it be a great idea to do this? And I said, yes, it'd be a great idea. And then he said, can I have one? I said, no. And I said, if we're going to have this, we're going to have a program, right? We're going to have a committee that's in charge of the program. We're going to make it clear across all of ALOG that we have these resources for this purpose, and everybody will be able to ask for it, right? It doesn't mean that because you had the idea or because you bumped into me on the stairs that you get to have one of these scholarships and not somebody else. And I think that this level of informality and sort of having information flow through personal contacts, this is something that's sort of embedded in the Swiss culture. And it comes from being a small country, But what happens when you have that kind of process is the people who are not so well connected, they don't ever get the information. They don't ever get access to the resources. And so that transition to make sure that things are more transparent and that the access is more obvious and visible, I think that's really improved over the time. And then there have been some specific programs that we put in to support women in academics, especially mothers, that I'm also extremely pleased about. My favorite one we call a Tailwind program. And so this is for women coming back from maternity leave. In Switzerland, mothers get 4 months of paid maternity leave. And when they come back, it's not the easiest transition. And so what we say is, if you put in a very short proposal just before you go out on your maternity leave to say, how could you use a certain amount of money, it's about 20,000 francs, to delegate and prioritize your work when you get back, then you get that money, basically. And the bar is pretty low. But what it does is a couple of things. It sends a message to the mothers that we value them, we want them to come back, and we understand that it's not so easy. And we are sort of encouraging them to think about setting priorities, to think about delegating, to focus their efforts on where their own work is really needed, and to actually make that possible. And it also sends that message to everybody else in the organization, even if they're not eligible. It's sort of an advertisement for our values. So I'm also very pleased about that.
Wow, that program is amazing. I've never heard of anything like that. So, I mean, it's really great, because I think for the woman herself to have written that proposal beforehand and to have something to look forward to when she gets back is also really important. I mean, I had 3 children, but I only got, you know, like 1 month for my first, 2 months for my second, and 3 for my third. I never had 4 months, but I remember when I came back to work after my third, 3 months was a long time to not be working. And I almost felt like my brain wasn't functioning anymore. You sort of get rusty because you're not doing that exact same thing all the time. So I think it's really, really cool that you created this program. And I'm sure, how many women do you think like annually would participate in something like this?
So ALVOG has we have about 500 people on staff, but this program is only for PhD students and PhD scientists, right? We get about 6 a year. Right? So it's for about 120,000 francs a year, we get essentially to really show all of ALVOG and outside of ALVOG what we're doing to support women staying in the workplace after having kids. And I'll send you the guideline for it. I'm happy to do that.
Well, I think we should share it with more entities, because I think it's a great program. The other thing that I was wondering about is, what is the gender ratio there? Is it 50-50, or is it male dominated, or overall, if you look at the whole place?
Well, so ALVOG is 50-50 overall, but it's very unevenly distributed, right? So for the scientists, well, for the PhD students and postdocs, it's also 50-50. For the scientists, starting with the tenure track group leaders and going up, so these are the people who either have permanent positions or have a potential and outlook for a permanent position. There we have between 20 and 30% women at all, well, until I retired, at all levels, going all the way up to the top, right? One of the problems there is that at the very top, you're talking about statistics of small numbers. So it goes from 100% women to 0, right? Boom, like just like that. And there's also is quite a difference in the different fields. So engineering is much more male dominated than some other fields, but in general, we're very aware of these issues, and we really try to put measures in place so that we're getting really strong women candidates for all different levels.
Since we were talking about you know, maternity leave and having women come back, is there childcare like as part of your facility, or is this, how does the whole childcare thing work there? Because I was just curious, here in the US, it's a very big problem.
So ALVOG does have childcare, and we've had it for, I think, over 25 years. So we're one of the first organizations to offer childcare. It is not cheap, right? Even though we subsidize it for lower income parents, it's still expensive. So it's not really comparable to some other European countries like France or Germany. I mean, it's just, they have much, much better childcare offerings than the Swiss do. But the universities, and usually in big cities, there's pretty good childcare if you can afford it. One thing I've heard though is that, I mean, our childcare is right at our facility, right? And so people then tend to run into a little bit of a problem when if they have more than one kid, right? And then the older kid is going to school, then it would be easier for them to have the childcare near the school where they're dropping off the older kid, and then they could drop off the younger kid at childcare. I've also heard from some people that it's like, well, then it falls on the ALVOG employee to bring the kid to childcare and not the partner if the partner is working somewhere else, because the childcare is by us. And I'm like, well, look, I can't solve these problems, right? Forget it. But that's something that we've taken seriously for a long time. And I think it's one of the reasons that we have good representation of women throughout the organization.
Great, thank you. My last formal question to you is what advice would you give to other women in STEM about their leadership journey and how they should approach it and maybe prepare for it or deal with obstacles?
So I think the most important thing is to find other people to talk to, especially women to talk to. I think there's a tendency to not be sure, a problem looks like it's developing, but is it really a problem or is it not a problem? Is there something I should be concerned about? Is there something that I should really be doing proactively? If you don't try and figure that out early enough and get some feedback about it too, very soon the train is enough off the track that it's hard to get it back on again. And so, I had a friend who started as a director of a Max Planck Institute, also from the US, just after I started at ALOG. And even though our institutions were really quite different from each other, the German system and the Swiss system are not at all alike, it was still extremely helpful to be able to talk to her, just to bounce some issues off and to say, look, I'm feeling a little bit strange about this, but, what do you think? And to have almost sort of a little kitchen cabinet. I think that that's really, really valuable. And so I would always say, find other women to talk to, especially women who have had similar kinds of experiences and can provide some insight into what you're going through.
Yeah, I think you really nailed two aspects of it. One of them is to catch a problem early on. That's number one. And the other one is to constantly, get the expert opinion of others, because another point of view is always so valuable, no matter who you are, how smart you are, how prepared you are. You never see things the same way as another person. So that's why, in fact, the whole women's leadership discussion and having a network of women that you can go to for advice is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be somebody you trust. And oftentimes it can't be somebody at your given institution because they can't be objective. They're involved. So really, it's a big mistake. We oftentimes, try to go to people who are in our department or in the next department or something like that. And it backfires because they're biased and they have their own agenda. And it just does not work.
Yeah, there's also a lot of value to getting multiple inputs. I mean, if you ask for advice, it doesn't mean you have to follow it. And people do have different perspectives on things. And this is what I don't like about formal mentorship programs, is it sort of locks you into one opinion. And that might actually not be the best opinion for some of the reasons you mentioned. And so having a sort of really multiple kinds of insight and feedback, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought of it in terms of mentorship programs, but that is a good point. The AWIS mentoring program we have is great because it's called a mentoring circle. So there are several mentors and several mentees. So you don't just have a one-to-one thing. And obviously it's not at your institution because it's a group outside wherever it is that you're working. So that's really helpful as well. Okay, I'm going to stop the official recording and then we can open it up to questions.